The morning sun barely touched the servant quarters when 12-year-old Daniel woke up to the sound of his mother moving quietly around their small room. She was already dressed in her work uniform, the simple gray dress that marked her as part of the household staff at Riverside Estate. Daniel watched her tie her hair back, the same way she did every morning, preparing for another long day of cleaning the mansion where wealthy families lived lives he could only imagine. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart," his mother whispered, noticing his open eyes. "You have school in an hour." But Daniel couldn't sleep. Not when he knew what Tuesday morning meant. Tuesday was piano lesson day at the main house, and if he timed it right, he could finish his breakfast and walk past the music room just as the lessons began. The Riverside Estate wasn't just any mansion. It was one of those old grand houses that looked like it belonged in a movie, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and in the center of it all sat a beautiful black grand piano that probably cost more than his mother earned in 10 years. The piano belonged to the Montgomery family, who owned the estate and employed Daniel's mother as their head housekeeper. Every Tuesday and Thursday, a famous piano teacher named Professor Wilhelm came to give lessons to the Montgomery children. People said he had played in concert halls all over Europe. He wore expensive suits and carried himself like royalty. His students were always rich kids whose parents paid hundreds of dollars per hour for his time. Daniel had discovered the piano lessons by accident 6 months ago. He'd been helping his mother carry fresh linens through the hallway when he heard it. The most beautiful sound he'd ever experienced in his life. Music was pouring out from behind those heavy wooden doors, and it seemed to reach right into his chest and grab hold of something he didn't know was there. He'd stopped dead in his tracks, nearly dropping the sheets. His mother had smiled at him knowingly. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she'd said softly. "That's the piano. Mrs. Montgomery's daughter is learning to play." From that day on, Daniel found every excuse to be near the music room during lesson times. He'd volunteer to polish the hallway floors, water the plants near the door, or organize supplies in the nearby closet. Anything to hear those sounds. His mother knew what he was doing but never said anything. She'd just give him little jobs that happened to keep him close to the music. The funny thing was, Daniel wasn't just listening because it sounded pretty. He was learning. Every instruction Professor Wilhelm gave, every correction, every technique he explained to his students, Daniel absorbed it all like a sponge. He couldn't see what was happening inside the room, but his ears painted the picture. When the professor said, No, curve your fingers like you're holding an egg," Daniel would curve his own fingers standing in the hallway. When he heard, "Feel the rhythm in your shoulders, let it flow down through your arms," Daniel would close his eyes and try to feel what that meant. His mother noticed him moving his fingers in the air sometimes, like he was pressing invisible keys. She'd catch him tapping rhythms on the dinner table or humming melodies he'd heard through the door. It made her heart ache a little, seeing her son fall in love with something so far out of their reach. "Mom," Daniel said one evening while they ate their simple dinner in their small room, "do you think I could ever learn to play piano?" She looked at her son, at his hopeful eyes, and struggled with what to say. The truth was, piano lessons cost money they didn't have. A real piano was completely impossible, but she couldn't bring herself to crush his dream. "Maybe someday, sweetheart," she said gently. "Keep listening and learning what you can. You never know what life might bring." What life brought 3 months later was Daniel's 12th birthday. He woke up that morning not expecting anything special. Birthdays in their household were usually just a homemade cake and a small gift. But when he opened his eyes, he saw something sitting on the small table in their room that made him sit up so fast he got dizzy. It was a keyboard. Not a real piano. Nothing like the grand instrument in the mansion's music room. It was old and electronic with yellowed keys and a crack along one side. Several keys stuck when you pressed them, and the speaker made crackling sounds. But to Daniel it might as well have been made of gold. "Mom?" he whispered, hardly believing it was real. His mother smiled, though her eyes were tired. "I've been saving," she said simply. "Found it at the second-hand shop downtown. The man gave me a good price because it's a bit broken, but it works. It's not much, but—" Daniel jumped up and hugged her so tight she laughed. "It's perfect," he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "It's absolutely perfect." That night, after his mother had gone to sleep, Daniel plugged in the keyboard and put on the headphones that came with it. He placed his fingers on the keys, remembering everything he'd heard Professor Wilhelm teach. Curve your fingers. Relax your wrists. Feel the weight of your arm. He pressed the first key. The sound was tinny and electronic, nothing like the rich tones of the grand piano upstairs. But it was music. It was his music. For the next 3 years, Daniel's life followed the same pattern. During the day, he went to school and helped his mother with small tasks around the estate. He'd still find time to listen at the music room door whenever he could, mentally noting new techniques and pieces. Then at night, in their quiet room, he'd practice on his broken keyboard for hours. His mother never complained about the late nights or the electricity it used. She'd just bring him water and remind him to rest his hands sometimes. Daniel taught himself to read music from library books. He learned theory from YouTube videos on their old phone, but mostly he learned by listening and experimenting. He'd hear Professor Wilhelm teach a piece upstairs, then go to his room and try to recreate it from memory. Sometimes it took him days to figure out a difficult section, playing the same measures over and over until his fingers remembered what his ears had heard. The other servants noticed the boy's dedication. Sometimes, late at night, they'd hear the faint electronic beeping from the servant quarters and smile to themselves. "That kid's got something special," the old gardener once told Daniel's mother. "You watch. He's going somewhere." But where could a maid's son go? The mansion upstairs held a world of privilege and opportunity that seemed impossible to reach. The Montgomery children took their piano lessons for granted, often complaining about practice time or rushing through pieces. They had every advantage: the best teachers, unlimited practice time on a professional instrument, and family connections that would open doors. Daniel had a broken keyboard, stolen hours of listening through doors, and a dream that everyone would have told him was foolish. But he had something else too. He had passion, pure and burning, the kind that wakes you up excited every morning and keeps you going when everything is difficult. He didn't know it yet, but that passion was about to change everything. Not just for him, but for everyone who believed that talent belonged only to those who could afford to pay for it. His moment was coming, closer than he imagined, and when it arrived, it would shake the comfortable world of Riverside Estate to its very foundation. 3 years had passed since Daniel got that old keyboard, and now at 15 he'd grown into a quiet, observant teenager who still spent every possible moment near the music room or practicing in his small quarters. His mother had watched him transform from a curious boy into someone completely devoted to music. She worried sometimes, wondering if she should have discouraged this impossible dream. But every time she thought about saying something, she'd see the light in his eyes when he played, and she'd keep quiet. The Riverside Estate was buzzing with unusual energy this particular October morning. The Montgomery family was preparing for their annual charity gala, the biggest social event they hosted all year. It was the kind of party where politicians, business owners, and wealthy families from all over the city came dressed in expensive gowns and tuxedos. They'd eat fancy food, drink champagne, and write big checks for whatever cause Mrs. Montgomery had chosen that year. For the staff, it meant weeks of extra work. Daniel's mother had been running herself ragged, coordinating with caterers, decorators, and the army of temporary workers hired for the event. Daniel had been pulled in to help too, spending his afternoons polishing silverware and setting up chairs instead of his usual listening sessions outside the music room. But there was one part of the gala that everyone was talking about. Mrs. Montgomery's son, 17-year-old Christopher, was going to perform a piano piece for all the guests. It was a big deal. Christopher had been taking lessons with Professor Wilhelm for almost 10 years now, and this performance was supposed to showcase all that expensive training. The professor had been working with him extra hard for the past 2 months, and Daniel had listened to every single practice session. The piece Christopher was preparing was incredibly difficult, something by a composer named Rachmaninoff. Even through the door, Daniel could hear how challenging it was. Christopher struggled with it constantly. He'd mess up, start over, mess up again. Professor Wilhelm's patient voice would guide him through it, but Daniel could hear the frustration building in both of them as the gala date approached. Daniel had gone home and learned the same piece on his keyboard. It had taken him 3 weeks of nightly practice working through each section slowly, but he'd figured it out. Not that anyone knew. Not that it mattered. Christopher would perform it on the grand piano for hundreds of important people, and Daniel would be in the corner somewhere, refilling water glasses. The evening of the gala arrived with perfect weather. Cars started pulling up to the estate at 7 o'clock, expensive vehicles that probably cost more than most people's houses. Daniel, wearing a simple black vest and white shirt that all the servers had been given, watched from his position near the refreshment table as the guests filed in. The women wore glittering jewelry and designer dresses. The men had watches that caught the light. Everything smelled like expensive perfume and ambition. The main hall had been transformed into something magical. White flowers everywhere, candles flickering on every surface, and right in the center of it all, the grand piano sat like a jewel, polished until it gleamed under the chandeliers. A small stage area had been set up around it, with rows of chairs arranged for the performance. Daniel's mother caught his eye from across the room and gave him a small smile. She looked tired but proud, seeing all her hard work come together. He smiled back, then returned his attention to making sure the refreshment table stayed organized. As dinner wrapped up and guests began taking their seats for the performance, Daniel noticed something odd. Christopher hadn't appeared yet. Mrs. Montgomery kept glancing toward the hallway, her smile looking increasingly forced. Professor Wilhelm stood near the piano, checking his watch with a concerned expression. Finally, Mr. Montgomery disappeared down the hallway. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The guests were getting restless, whispering among themselves. Then Mr. Montgomery returned alone, walked directly to his wife, and whispered something in her ear. Daniel saw her face go pale. Professor Wilhelm was called over. There was a hurried, hushed conversation. The professor's face turned red, then almost purple. He looked like he wanted to explode, but was holding it back because of all the important people watching. Mrs. Montgomery stepped up to address the guests, her voice steady despite the obvious crisis. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. Christopher is feeling unwell and won't be able to perform this evening. We'll move directly to the charity auction portion of—" "Nonsense," Professor Wilhelm interrupted, his accent thicker with emotion. "We cannot simply cancel. I have prepared him for months. He was clearly more worried about his own reputation than anything else. Daniel later learned what had actually happened. Christopher had been in his room, completely frozen with stage fright. The pressure had finally gotten to him. All those years of lessons, all that money, all those expectations, and when the moment came, he just couldn't do it. He'd refused to come out, actually locked his door. His parents were mortified, but what could they do? You can't force someone to perform when they're having a breakdown. The guests were murmuring now, some looking sympathetic, others clearly annoyed that they'd come all this way for a canceled performance. Daniel could see Mrs. Montgomery calculating the social damage of this disaster. These were people who expected entertainment for their charity dollars, and that's when something inside Daniel shifted. He didn't plan it, didn't think it through. One moment he was standing behind the refreshment table, and the next moment he was walking forward. His heart was hammering so hard he thought everyone could probably hear it. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. Nobody heard him. The conversations continued. He cleared his throat and spoke louder. "Excuse me, I can play," this time people heard. Heads turned. The conversation stopped. For a moment there was just confused silence as 200 wealthy people tried to process what they were seeing. A teenage server, clearly part of the staff based on his simple uniform, standing in the middle of their event claiming he could play piano. Then someone laughed. Just one person at first, then another, and suddenly the whole room was filled with amused chuckling. It wasn't mean-spirited exactly, more like they thought it was a joke, some cute attempt at entertainment. Professor Wilhelm's face transformed into something between outrage and disbelief. He strode toward Daniel, his expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor. "This is absurd," he said, his voice tight. "Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? That piece requires years of training, discipline, proper instruction. You think you can just walk up and play it?" "I know I can play it, sir," Daniel said, his voice steadier now. His mother had appeared at the edge of his vision, her face showing pure panic, but he couldn't look at her. If he looked at her, he'd lose his nerve. "Where did you train?" Professor Wilhelm demanded. "What school? Who was your teacher?" "I taught myself, sir. I listened to your lessons and practiced on my own." The laughter grew louder. Someone in the back called out, "Oh, this should be good." More chuckling rippled through the crowd. They thought this was part of the entertainment now, some amusing distraction from the canceled performance. Mr. Montgomery stood up, clearly about to put an end to this embarrassing situation. But Mrs. Montgomery grabbed his arm. Daniel saw something calculating cross her face. The evening was already a disaster. Their son had humiliated them by refusing to perform. Maybe letting this staff kid try would at least give people something to talk about besides Christopher's failure. At worst, it would be a brief embarrassment that everyone could laugh about. At best, well, there was no best-case scenario in her mind. "Let him try," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "Why not? We've already ruined the evening's plans." The room erupted in excited chatter. This was better than they'd hoped for. Not only would they see the maid's son embarrass himself, but they'd have an incredible story to tell at their next dinner parties. Professor Wilhelm looked like he wanted to argue, but Mrs. Montgomery had made her decision. He stepped aside with obvious disgust, crossing his arms as if preparing to witness a catastrophe. Daniel walked to the piano, aware of every eye in the room following him. His hands were shaking slightly. He'd never touched a real piano before, never sat at a bench like this, never played anything besides his broken electronic keyboard with the sticky keys. He sat down, adjusted the bench the way he'd seen Christopher do dozens of times, and placed his fingers on the keys. The ivory was smooth and cool under his fingertips, so different from the plastic keys he knew. The room fell silent, but it wasn't the respectful silence of an audience ready to listen. It was the expectant hush of people waiting for a joke to reach its punchline. Someone in the third row was already smiling, ready to laugh. Daniel took a deep breath, closed his eyes for just a moment, and began to play. The first note hung in the air like a question. Daniel's finger had pressed the key with more force than he'd intended, nervous energy making him heavy-handed, but the sound that came out was nothing like his keyboard at home. It was rich and full, resonating through the entire hall in a way that made his chest tighten with emotion. He took a breath and continued. The second note was softer, more controlled. Then the third. His fingers found their rhythm, and suddenly he wasn't thinking anymore. He was just playing. But here's the thing that nobody expected. Daniel didn't try to play the Rachmaninoff piece that Christopher had been preparing. That would have been too obvious, too much like he was trying to compete directly. Instead, he played something he'd heard Professor Wilhelm teach almost 2 years ago, a piece by Chopin that had stuck in his memory like a beautiful dream he couldn't forget. The music started gentle, almost like a whisper. In the audience, the smiles began to fade. People leaned forward slightly, not quite sure what they were hearing. Was this kid actually playing? Really playing? Daniel's fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence. Every lesson he'd absorbed through that door, every night spent practicing on his broken keyboard, every visualization of proper hand position and technique, it all came flooding back through his hands. His wrists stayed relaxed, just like Professor Wilhelm always instructed. His fingers curved naturally, and he let his whole arm carry the weight of each note rather than just using his fingers. But something else was happening too. Something that couldn't be taught through a door or learned from any lesson. Daniel was pouring every feeling he'd ever had into that music. All the mornings watching his mother leave for work before dawn. All the nights hearing her come home exhausted. All the times he'd pressed his ear against that door, wishing he could be on the other side. All the dreams that seemed impossible and all the hope he carried anyway. It was all there in the music, raw and honest and completely real. The whispers in the room had stopped entirely now. People sat frozen, their champagne glasses forgotten in their hands. A woman in the second row had her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes wide. An older gentleman who'd been checking his phone earlier had set it down, completely absorbed. Daniel reached the middle section of the piece where the melody shifted from gentle to passionate. His hands moved faster, jumping across the keys with precision he didn't even know he had. The grand piano responded to every touch, every nuance, producing sounds his little keyboard could never make. It was like he'd been painting with crayons his whole life, and someone had just handed him oil paints and a full palette of colors. Professor Wilhelm stood frozen near the wall, his arms no longer crossed. His mouth had actually fallen open slightly. He took a step closer, then another, as if drawn by the music. His trained ear was hearing something that shocked him to his core. This wasn't just good. This was exceptional. The boy's technique had rough edges, sure, small things that showed his lack of formal training. But the musicality, the feeling, the natural understanding of how to make the piano sing, that couldn't be faked or copied, that was pure gift. Daniel's mother stood in the doorway to the kitchen, tears streaming down her face. She'd known her son loved music, had watched him practice for years, but she'd never heard him play on a real piano before. She'd never known he could do this. Her hand covered her mouth as she watched her boy, her Daniel, commanding the attention of all these powerful people who normally wouldn't even notice he existed. The piece built toward its climax, and Daniel felt something click into place inside him. This was what he was meant to do. Not someday, not in some distant future if he was lucky. Right now. This moment. His fingers flew across the keys, the music swelling until it filled every corner of the massive hall. The chandelier above seemed to shimmer in response to the vibrations. Then gradually he brought the music back down. The passion softened into something tender and bittersweet. His fingers slowed, each note carefully placed like precious stones. The melody wound its way to the conclusion, getting quieter and quieter until the final note was barely more than a whisper. Daniel played the last key and let it fade naturally, his foot still on the sustain pedal, letting that final sound ring out until it dissolved into silence. For what felt like forever, nobody moved. The silence in that room was absolute. Daniel sat at the piano, his hands still hovering over the keys, suddenly very aware of where he was and what he'd just done. Had it been good? Had he messed up? He'd been so lost in the music that he honestly couldn't remember every detail. Then Mr. Montgomery stood up. His face was unreadable, stern even. Daniel's heart sank. He'd overstepped. He'd made a fool of himself and embarrassed his mother in front of her employers. He started to stand, ready to apologize, but then Mr. Montgomery started clapping, slow at first, his hands coming together with heavy, deliberate strikes that echoed through the silent room. His wife looked up at him in surprise, then she stood too and began to applaud. Then someone else stood, and another, and suddenly the entire room was on their feet. The applause started as a ripple and built into a roar. People weren't just clapping politely. They were cheering. A man in the back actually whistled. The woman who'd had her hand on her chest was crying openly now, still applauding. The older gentleman was shaking his head in disbelief, a huge smile on his face as he clapped so hard his hands must have hurt. Daniel stood awkwardly, not sure what to do. He'd never received applause before. He looked over at his mother and saw her beaming at him through her tears, clapping proudly. That made his own eyes sting with emotion. Professor Wilhelm walked straight up to the piano, his expensive shoes clicking on the floor. The room quieted down as people sat back down, sensing something important was about to happen. Daniel braced himself, still half expecting the professor to be angry at this disruption of his professional world. The professor stopped right in front of Daniel, studying his face intensely. "How long have you been training?" he asked, his accent making each word precise and sharp. "I haven't trained, sir," Daniel said honestly. "Not formally. I just listened to your lessons and practiced on my own at night." "Listened to my lessons," Professor Wilhelm repeated slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made sense. "You learned to play like that by listening through a door?" "Yes, sir. And I have a keyboard at home. It's broken, but it works enough to practice." The professor's expression was impossible to read. He turned to look at the piano, then back at Daniel. "You have never taken a proper lesson? Never had anyone show you hand position, technique, how to read the emotional content of a piece?" "No, sir. Just what I could hear you teaching to the other students." Professor Wilhelm was quiet for a long moment. The entire room watched this interaction with fascination. Finally he spoke, and his voice carried to every corner of the hall. "I have been teaching piano for 42 years. I have instructed over 300 students in that time. Many came from the finest families, had every advantage one could imagine. Access to the best instruments, unlimited practice time, connections to open doors in the music world. Most of them were talented. Some were quite good." He paused, and something like wonder crossed his stern face. "But in 42 years I have never encountered raw, natural talent like this." A murmur ran through the crowd. Daniel wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Was the professor complimenting him? "What you did just now," Professor Wilhelm continued, "cannot be taught. The technical elements, yes, those can be refined. But the musicality, the emotional intelligence, the natural understanding of how to connect with an audience through sound, that is a gift, a rare gift." He turned to address the room, his voice ringing with authority. This young man taught himself to play at this level by listening and practicing on a broken keyboard. Imagine what he could do with proper training, with proper instruments, with the opportunities that most of our children take for granted. Mrs. Montgomery stood up again, and Daniel noticed her expression had completely changed. She wasn't looking at him like he was a staff member anymore. She was looking at him like he was something valuable, something that reflected well on her household. But it was Professor Wilhelm who spoke next, and what he said would change everything. "I would like to offer you something," he said, turning back to Daniel. "I will train you personally, free of charge. You will need to work harder than any student I have ever taught. I will demand more from you precisely because you have the ability to achieve it. But if you are willing to dedicate yourself completely, I believe we can turn this raw talent into something truly extraordinary." The room erupted in excited chatter. Daniel looked at his mother, who had moved closer, her eyes asking if this was real. He looked back at the professor, at this stern man who usually only taught the children of millionaires, and could barely process what was being offered. "I'll work as hard as you need me to, sir," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the emotion swirling inside him. "I promise you won't regret this." Professor Wilhelm allowed himself a small smile, the first one Daniel had ever seen on his face. "I don't think I will," he said. "Now let's discuss how we're going to structure your training. We have a lot of work ahead of us." The morning after the gala, Daniel woke up convinced he'd dreamed the whole thing. But when he opened his eyes, his mother was sitting on the edge of his bed, holding a piece of paper with Professor Wilhelm's contact information written in careful handwriting. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying, but she was smiling. "It really happened," she whispered. "My baby, it really happened." News of Daniel's performance spread through the estate like wildfire. The other staff members treated him differently now, some with pride, others with a strange distance like he'd already left their world behind. Christopher Montgomery didn't come out of his room for 3 days. His parents had hired a therapist to help him work through what had happened, though the real damage was to his ego more than anything else. But the most surprising reaction came from Mr. Montgomery himself. 2 days after the gala, he called Daniel and his mother into his private study. Daniel had never been in that room before. It smelled like old books and expensive cigars. Mr. Montgomery sat behind his massive desk, fingers steepled, studying Daniel with the same intense look he probably used in business negotiations. "That was quite a performance," he said finally. "You've created an interesting situation." Daniel's mother tensed beside him, and Daniel felt his stomach drop. "Here it comes," he thought. "They're going to ask us to leave." Too much drama, too much attention. But Mr. Montgomery surprised them. "My wife and I have been discussing what to do. Frankly, having a musical prodigy associated with our household could be excellent for our reputation. It shows we recognize and support talent regardless of background. Very progressive. Good publicity." He said it so matter-of-factly, like Daniel was a business investment rather than a person. But Daniel had learned early in life that you take opportunities where you find them, even if they come with mixed motives. "We are prepared to offer you a room in the East Wing," Mr. Montgomery continued. "Small but private. Your mother will continue in her position, of course, but you'll have proper space to practice. We'll have an upright piano moved in for you. Not a grand, but serviceable for training purposes." Daniel couldn't speak. "A room, a real piano?" His mother squeezed his hand so tight it hurt. "There's one condition," Mr. Montgomery added. "You'll need to continue your regular education, maintain good grades. I won't have people saying we let you neglect your studies for music. And you'll help around the estate when needed. This is an opportunity, not a free ride. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Daniel managed to say. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Professor Wilhelm's training began the following Monday, and Daniel quickly discovered what the professor had meant about working harder than anyone else. The lessons were nothing like what he'd heard through the door. Those had been patient, measured instructions for wealthy students who could afford to learn slowly. With Daniel, the professor was relentless. "Again" became the word Daniel heard most often. "No, the fingering is wrong. Again, your wrist is tense. Again, you're rushing the tempo. Again." They started at 6 in the morning before Daniel's school day began. He'd practice for 2 hours, stumble through his regular classes in a daze, then return for another 3-hour session in the afternoon. His fingers developed calluses. His back ached from sitting at the piano bench. Some nights he fell asleep with his head on his desk, too exhausted to even make it to his new bed. His mother watched with concern. "Maybe you should rest more," she'd say, bringing him tea during practice sessions. "You're pushing yourself too hard." But Daniel couldn't rest. Every time he sat at that piano, he remembered the feeling of playing at the gala, of making all those people listen, really listen. He remembered the look on Professor Wilhelm's face. He couldn't waste this chance. The professor pushed him through technique exercises that made his hands cramp, music theory that made his head spin. He had to learn to read complex sheet music fluently, something he'd only dabbled in before. The professor would tap his baton against the music stand when Daniel made mistakes, the sharp clicking sound like a judge's gavel. "You have natural talent," Professor Wilhelm would say, his accent thick with frustration. "But talent without discipline is just noise. We are building something here. Foundation. Structure. You cannot skip steps." About 6 weeks into training, something shifted. Daniel was working through a particularly difficult Bach piece, his fingers tangling over a complicated fugue section. He'd been at it for an hour, making the same mistake over and over. He could feel his frustration building, that familiar sense of not being good enough, of being an imposter in a world where he didn't belong. "Stop," Professor Wilhelm said suddenly. "What are you feeling right now?" "Frustrated," Daniel admitted. "Angry at myself? Good, use it." Music is not just about technical perfection. It is about channeling emotion, even the difficult ones, especially the difficult ones. Play it again, but this time let that frustration flow through your fingers. Make the piano feel what you feel. Daniel tried again and something clicked. The notes were the same, but suddenly they had weight, purpose, emotion behind them. The fugue came alive under his hands, each voice distinct and powerful. When he finished, Professor Wilhelm was nodding slowly. "There," he said quietly. "That is what I've been waiting for. The technique and the gift working together." The other students Professor Wilhelm taught began to hear about Daniel. Some were curious, asking their parents if they could meet the boy who'd taught himself to play. Others were threatened, suddenly working harder in their own lessons, afraid of being shown up by someone who'd started with nothing. Christopher Montgomery finally emerged from his isolation, though he avoided Daniel completely. They'd pass each other in the hallways of the estate, and Christopher would look away quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment. Daniel actually felt bad for him. He hadn't meant to humiliate anyone. He just wanted to play. One afternoon, about 4 months into his training, Professor Wilhelm made an announcement that stopped Daniel's heart. "There is a competition," he said, pulling out a brochure. "The Regional Young Musicians Competition. It takes place in 6 months. I'm entering you." "6 months?" Daniel's voice cracked. "But I've only been training formally for 4 months. Everyone else will have years of experience." "Yes," the professor agreed calmly. "They will have years of expensive lessons, prestigious teachers, every advantage. And you will beat them anyway. How can you be so sure?" Professor Wilhelm looked at him with those intense eyes. "Because they play music. You live it. There is a difference, and the judges will hear it. But," he held up a finger, "this means we work even harder. No more good enough. From now on, everything must be exceptional." The next 6 months were the most intense period of Daniel's life. School became something he barely registered, just going through the motions. Every spare moment went to the piano. The piece he'd be performing was his own choice, something Professor Wilhelm had suggested with a knowing smile. "Play something that tells your story," the professor had said. "Let them hear where you came from and where you're going." Daniel chose to arrange and perform a piece that blended classical technique with melodies from the folk songs his mother used to sing while cleaning. It was unconventional, risky even. Most competitors would play established classical pieces by famous composers. But Daniel's piece would be unique, personal, undeniably his. His mother listened to him practice it one night, and when he finished, she was crying again. "That's my song," she whispered. "The lullaby I sang when you were little." "You remembered?" "I remember everything, Mom," he said softly. "Every song, every sacrifice, every early morning when you left for work. It's all in there." As the competition date approached, Daniel felt the pressure building. Professor Wilhelm's expectations were sky high. Mr. Montgomery had started telling his business associates about our protégé, claiming credit for discovering Daniel's talent. Even Mrs. Montgomery would stop by practice sessions occasionally, nodding approvingly as if she'd planned this all along. But the person whose opinion mattered most was his mother. She'd pull him aside some evenings and remind him gently, "Don't forget who you are in all of this. Don't let them change you. You're still my Daniel, the boy who listened at doors because he loved music, not because he wanted to be famous." "I won't forget," he'd promise her, and he meant it. The week before the competition, Professor Wilhelm did something unexpected. He canceled their session. "No practice today," he said. "You need rest. Your fingers need rest. More importantly, your mind needs rest. You are ready. Trust in that." Daniel spent the day walking through the gardens of the estate thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. Less than a year ago, he'd been sneaking glances at the piano through doorways. Now he had his own practice room, his own instrument, training from one of the best teachers in the country. But had he really changed that much? He was still the same person. Still loved music for the same reasons. Still got nervous before playing. Still doubted himself sometimes. The night before they were supposed to leave for the competition, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling of his new room, and felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him. Tomorrow he'd walk onto a stage in front of judges who'd spent their lives evaluating musicians. He'd compete against kids who'd never had to worry about whether they could afford lessons, who'd never practiced on broken keyboards, who'd never had to prove they deserved to be there. His mother seemed to sense his anxiety. She knocked softly and came in, sitting on the edge of his bed like she used to when he was little. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "I'm proud of you. Not because of how well you play or whether you win. I'm proud because you took an impossible dream and made it real. That takes more courage than any performance." Daniel felt some of the pressure ease. She was right. He'd already won in a way. Everything else was just extra. "Now get some sleep," she said, kissing his forehead. "Tomorrow you show them what a maid's son can do." The concert hall was nothing like Daniel had imagined. It was massive, with rows of red velvet seats rising up like waves, and a stage that seemed to stretch forever under bright lights. The piano sitting in the center looked small and lonely despite its size. Daniel stood backstage with the other competitors, trying to keep his hands from shaking. There were 23 participants in total, all between the ages of 15 and 18. Daniel watched them warming up in the practice rooms, each one looking polished and confident in their expensive concert clothes. The girls wore elegant dresses, the boys wore tailored suits. Daniel's suit was borrowed from Mr. Montgomery's nephew, altered by his mother's skilled hands to fit properly. It looked fine, but he felt like everyone could tell it wasn't really his. A girl with perfect posture and diamond earrings glanced at him and whispered something to her friend. They both looked at him and giggled. Daniel pretended not to notice, but his stomach churned. He didn't belong here. These were kids who'd grown up in recital halls, who'd performed dozens of times. This was his first real competition ever. Professor Wilhelm appeared beside him, his hand firm on Daniel's shoulder. "I can see you spiraling," he said quietly. "Stop it, you earned your place here. Remember that? What if I mess up? What if I freeze like Christopher did?" "Then you freeze," the professor said simply. "But I don't think you will. You know why? Because when you play, you're not thinking about winning or losing. You're not thinking about what people expect. You're just sharing something true. That's what makes you different from most of these children. They play to impress. You play because you must." The competition began at 2 in the afternoon. Daniel had drawn number 17, which meant a lot of waiting. He sat in the wings, listening to each performance through the stage monitors. The first competitor played a flawless Beethoven sonata, technically perfect but somehow forgettable. The second did a Liszt piece that was all flash and speed, impressive but cold. One by one, they performed. Some were brilliant, making Daniel's anxiety spike. Others made mistakes, which somehow made him feel worse rather than better. A boy in a silver-gray suit stumbled through his piece and walked off stage with tears in his eyes. His mother met him in the wings, hugging him while he sobbed. Daniel looked away, feeling like he was intruding on something private. His own mother sat in the audience, 3 rows from the back. She'd taken the day off work, something she almost never did. He'd spotted her when he first came out, wearing her best dress, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Next to her sat Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, who'd come to watch their investment, as Mr. Montgomery had called him in the car. "Number 17, Daniel Torres, you're up in 5 minutes," a stagehand called out. Daniel's heart jumped into his throat. Professor Wilhelm appeared again, straightening Daniel's collar even though it didn't need straightening. "Remember," he said, "the piano is your friend. It wants to sing for you. Let it. And Daniel? Make them listen." The previous competitor finished to polite applause. Daniel watched him exit, looking satisfied with his performance. Then the announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Our next performer is Daniel Torres, age 15, performing an original composition titled Elena's Hands." There was a slight murmur at the word original. Most competitors played established classical pieces. Writing your own was risky, especially for someone so young. Daniel walked onto the stage and the lights were blinding. He couldn't see his mother in the audience anymore, couldn't see anyone really. Just darkness beyond the bright stage lights and the piano waiting for him. His feet felt heavy, like he was walking through water. The walk to the piano bench felt like it took forever. He sat down, adjusted the bench exactly the way Professor Wilhelm had taught him, and placed his hands on the keys. They were cool and smooth, familiar now after months of practice. He took a breath, closed his eyes, and let everything else fall away. The competition, the judges, the fancy kids in their expensive clothes, all of it disappeared. In his mind, he saw his mother, not as she was now, sitting in the audience, but as she'd been throughout his childhood. He saw her hands, rough from years of cleaning, gently braiding his hair before school. He saw her tired smile when she came home late at night but still asked about his day. He saw her counting coins on their small table, trying to figure out if they could afford something extra. He saw her face when she gave him that broken keyboard, knowing it wasn't much but hoping it was enough. Daniel began to play. The piece started soft and simple, like a lullaby. It was built around the folk melody his mother used to sing, but transformed, elevated through classical technique into something that honored both where he came from and where he was going. His fingers moved across the keys with confidence now, 6 months of intense training evident in every note. The melody built slowly, layer by layer. He introduced complexity gradually, weaving in harmonies that represented the richness he'd discovered in music, the doors it had opened. But the core melody remained pure, unchanged, a thread of truth running through everything. In the audience, his mother had both hands pressed to her heart. Tears streamed down her face as she heard her simple lullaby transformed into something magnificent. Mrs. Montgomery glanced at her with surprise, then returned her attention to the stage. Even she seemed moved, though she'd never admit it. Daniel reached the middle section where the piece became more intense. This was the struggle part, the representation of every obstacle, every closed door, every moment he'd wanted to give up. His hands flew across the keys, the music urgent and powerful. Some people in the audience leaned forward in their seats. The judges, 3 distinguished musicians seated at a long table in the front row, were scribbling notes frantically. The eldest judge, a woman with silver hair who'd performed with symphonies around the world, had stopped writing entirely. She just watched, her expression unreadable. Then Daniel brought the music back to that simple melody, but changed now, enriched by everything that had come before. It was the same song but deeper, fuller, with understanding earned through experience. He played the final section with tender precision, each note carefully placed, meaningful. The melody wound down slowly like a story coming to its natural end. The last note hung in the air, sustained by the pedal, fading gradually into silence. Daniel lifted his hands from the keys and finally opened his eyes. For a moment, no one moved. The silence stretched out and Daniel felt panic rising. Had he messed up? Had his original composition been a terrible mistake? Then someone started clapping. Not polite, measured applause, but enthusiastic, real clapping. Then another person joined in, and another. Suddenly, the entire audience was on their feet, applause rolling through the hall like thunder. Daniel stood up shakily, bowed the way Professor Wilhelm had taught him, and walked off stage on legs that felt like rubber. In the wings, Professor Wilhelm was smiling. Actually smiling, something Daniel had only seen a handful of times. That, he said simply, was exactly what I knew you could do. The rest of the competition passed in a blur. Daniel barely heard the final performances. When all 23 competitors had finished, there was a 30-minute break while the judges deliberated. Daniel sat backstage, too nervous to eat the sandwich his mother brought him, too wired to sit still. Finally, everyone was called back to the stage. All 23 competitors lined up as the head judge. The silver-haired woman stepped up to the microphone. This year's competition showcased remarkable talent, she began. Every performer demonstrated skill and dedication that speaks well of their training. Daniel's heart pounded. Just get it over with, he thought. However, the judge continued, occasionally we encounter something that transcends technical ability. Something that reminds us why music matters, why we devote our lives to this art form. She paused, looking down at her notes. This year that something came from an unexpected place. From a young man who taught himself to play by listening through doors, who practiced on a broken keyboard, who had the courage to write his own composition for this competition. Daniel felt like he couldn't breathe. The first place award, including a full scholarship to the National Conservatory of Music, goes to Daniel Torres. The applause was deafening. Daniel stood frozen until Professor Wilhelm literally pushed him forward. He walked to accept the trophy on shaking legs, and when the silver-haired judge handed it to him, she leaned in close. Your piece made me cry, she whispered. In 30 years of judging, that's only happened 3 times. Keep playing. The world needs to hear what you have to say. In the audience, his mother was sobbing openly, not caring who saw. Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery were clapping, already calculating how this would benefit their reputation. But none of that mattered to Daniel in that moment. What mattered was that he'd taken an impossible dream and made it real. A boy who'd started with nothing but love for music and the determination to learn had just won one of the most prestigious youth competitions in the country. He'd be going to conservatory, studying with the best teachers, performing on the best stages. But more than any of that, he'd honored his mother. He'd taken the lullaby she sang while scrubbing other people's floors and turned it into something beautiful, something that made people listen, really listen. He'd shown everyone that talent doesn't care about your address or your bank account or who your parents are. Years later, when Daniel performed in concert halls around the world, he always started his performances the same way. He'd tell the audience about a boy who listened at doors and dreamed impossible dreams. He'd talk about a mother who saved coins to buy a broken keyboard. And then he'd play Elena's Hands, reminding himself and everyone else that the most beautiful music often comes from the most unlikely places. Because talent isn't about where you start. It's about whether you have the courage to begin.